We're ready to start. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're excited to have another edition of our digital wellness webinars. And today we're focusing on algorithmic bias in dating apps, but algorithmic bias exists across many apps and platforms. So much of what we learned today can be applied and used across the internet in our digital world. My name is Amira Dalla, and I'm calling in from New York. I work at Consumer Reports. And I have been following our algorithmic justice work at Consumer Reports and in the broader technology sphere for a very long time. Very much in the world we live in, we are more connected now more than ever. And a lot of what we're using to stay connected is based on internet connected devices, AI devices, smart devices, and they're all fueled by algorithms. So it is crucial for us to understand and learn how algorithms are used, how they are created, and the impacts they can have so that we better understand the products and we can improve and hold accountable the people who are helping create these things to make sure that they are used fairly and equitably. Consumer Reports is long time dedicated to making sure that this is an issue that is front and center and that our products that we're bringing in our home are not only safe for us, but they meet our needs and they are treating us with fair, just, and equity. I'm really, really excited to have some co-speakers with me today from Mozilla Foundation and Consumers International. And I'm going to introduce them in a bit, but on the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the agenda so we know what we are covering for today. We're going to do some introduction and housekeeping. We're going to go through a really important report that Consumer International and Mozilla have just released on pricing transparency in dating apps. We're going to talk about how algorithmic bias and other privacy issues impact dating apps and potentially apps even more broadly. We're going to talk about what you as an individual, as a consumer, a user of these tools can actually do. And then we're going to leave as much room as we can for questions from you. So please do drop them into the Q&A section. My colleague Alan is hanging out there and we'll be able to help field them and we'll be able to talk about them a little bit more down the road as well. Just very quickly on the housekeeping items, please join the chat. We're most excited to have you here and hear from you. You can use the chat function. Alan is also popping in there and discussing any relevant needs or concerns that might come up. But also use the question feature to ask any questions so we can be able to see your support there and what you want to know. We are recording so that we can share this with people afterwards. So please don't share anything that is too sensitive to you or you would not want others to see or hear. We have enabled closed captioning. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom, you can select how to turn on and off the closed captioning if that is distracting for you. And then just in case there's any other questions in terms of connection or being able to follow, please let us know. We will be sending a copy of the recording and the video to you all afterwards, and we will be here to answer questions if they come up. Just also, if you are participating with us, you are adhering to our code of conduct. We make sure that we provide a respectful and safe space for everyone here today. We will drop our code of conduct in the chat. Please be sure to check it out. And if there are any instances that do not adhere to our code of conduct, we will be taking any sort of measures. So I just have dropped that in there right now. Okay, I am so excited to introduce my co-speakers today. So I'm going to kick it off to them to introduce themselves. Charlie Worthington from Consumer International is joining us today. Charlie, can you say hello? Tell us where you're calling in from and what do you do?
Hi, Amira. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm Charlie, joining you from London in the UK. I'm here with Consumers International, which, for those who aren't familiar, is a global membership organization for consumer groups. We bring together more than 200 member organizations across more than 100 countries, including Consumer Reports here in the US. I'm joining today as the lead researcher on Consumers International and Mozilla's recent report, Consumer Investigation into Personalized Pricing, focused on personalized pricing, so charging different prices for different individuals based on algorithms, focusing with including a case study, so addressing it as a systematic issue kind of across this online economy, focusing on a case study of dating app Tinder to highlight how different individuals are being charged different prices. But really looking forward to today's conversation.
Thanks, Charlie. And for all of you who have piqued your interest in what exactly that report and information means, we will have Charlie go through some of the findings with us shortly. But before we do, hello, Jen. Tell us where you're calling in from and what do you do?
Hello, everybody. I'm Jen Coltrider. I work for Mozilla and I live in the mountains of Colorado. And at Mozilla, I lead our privacy not included buyer's guide research and all the work. And so I spend my time looking into consumer tech products to decide are they safe and private for users, or should they come with a privacy not included warning label? So I can talk a little bit about algorithmic bias. I'm going to lean on Charlie to do most of that, but I can also talk a lot about privacy and dating apps. We reviewed dating apps for privacy last year, and a bit of a teaser is they're terrible. So stay tuned.
Right. So we are covering the gambit of both algorithmic bias and privacy in general as it affects us in these apps. But as so much of what Jen, Charlie, and I know, this is relevant to many of the apps and programs that we're using online these days. And so thank you so much for being with us, Charlie and Jen. I'm really looking forward to discussion. I have a bunch of questions, and I know the people joining us have already been sharing some of the questions they have as well. So I'm going to just jump right into it. But I do know before we get started on anything, we do have a lot of people joining us who are coming in at different technical levels. Some of us have heard the words algorithm. Some of us even heard algorithmic bias. Some of us have heard AI. But just for those that are still trying to figure out a grasp on some of these terms, which are newer, are confusing, so don't worry. I just want to do some level setting on what is considered algorithmic bias in a product, and what does that mean and how does that impact us? Charlie, do you want to kick it off here and give us a little bit of a rundown?
Yeah, for sure. So algorithms essentially, there's a whole load of functions. It's a big topic, obviously, is why it can be so confusing. But algorithms essentially are a tool for computer decision making. So essentially are dependent on the data that we input and the instructions, the code that determines what the outputs are and gets the computer to make these decisions kind of on a massive scale. Algorithmic bias is when the decisions made by the computer based on this data inputted and the instructions given are systematically and repeatedly skewed in a particular direction. So in particular, when these are creating unfair outcomes for a certain group of people. There can be lots of causes for this bias. It can be about the data the algorithm is trained on, so prepare it to make these decisions. It can be the data inputted for individual decisions, or it can be these instructions that are guiding the decision making. And obviously this bias isn't inherent to the computer. It's based on real world biases, either from biases brought in by the kind of humans who produce and run these algorithms, or just brought in by just mistakes, often can lead to kind of unintended consequences. All algorithms are intended to produce repeatable outcomes, often deliberately involving the selection of certain groups, which can be legitimate. An obvious example from dating apps is the matchmaking algorithm that pairs people and is intended to pair people that they think will go well together. Algorithmic bias is when this selection process is unintentionally and systematically unfair, which is bad enough, obviously, in matchmaking algorithms if you're excluding certain groups of people. But something we've been looking into is there's also really dangerous consequences for the consumer in pricing if certain groups are charged more money than others if algorithms are used in pricing contexts.
Thanks, Charlie. The things that I find really interesting to know about algorithmic bias are it's also the data sets, but also human bias that can occur. So it's a matter of not just like the data that exists that we look at, which might be like old or outdated, but it's actually also just the people who are creating these platforms are creating the circumstances to use these algorithms that are introducing their own biases as well into the product or platform. So I think those are two things to really take away is like biases can occur in many ways. But also what's really interesting to note on the algorithmic bias front is that, you know, I mentioned earlier, so much of our world is becoming connected, particularly in the last few years, that are so many more smart products and more of us now have them in our homes, whether it's smart TVs or smart light bulbs. All of these things are really fueled by new technology, a lot of them by algorithms potentially and what they're serving us. So it could be the products in our homes, it could be online platforms, and it also seeps into our everyday in different ways. So whether it is applying for credit or getting a loan, or being matchmaked on a dating app, or getting access to healthcare services, algorithms are the decision makers in these processes. And it's so important for them to not have the biases that they do, because oftentimes these biases reflect the inequity that lives in our society right now. And so we really want to understand how to control these biases, how to make sure they aren't treating people unfairly, and really be able to make sure that they are equitable in the way we want to build a more just society going forward, because we are seeing them impact both our digital lives, but our personal lives in so many ways, and restrict barriers, or have barriers and restrict our access in other sorts of ways that are reproduced offline as well. So it's so important to really carve out space to understand in this field, but then also really know what we can do, because this is growing and evolving so quickly, much quicker than our policies, but I'll talk about that after. And so we really need to make sure that we're bringing more attention and light towards this. And I'll say one more thing before we jump into Charlie's slides, Alan, as you pull those up. But the one thing that I really want to call out for algorithmic biases or discrimination through these platforms is that it's really hard for us to actually know when it's happening. Charlie, maybe you can even talk about this as it relates to the study, but one of the things people often don't realize is like when a bias impacts them, because it's hard to know what's happening to you versus other people that are getting potentially different rates or preferences or prices or whatever it is. So that's why we do need to have more conversation on this, because people sometimes don't know what it means, but also doesn't know when it affects them or when they might be surveilled or treated differently as a result. But Charlie, you can either comment on that, or I'm just going to let you jump into your report.
No, agreed completely. And that's why I think so much of our work in this space is about highlighting, obviously there's a need for individuals to understand this as far as possible, to maximize protection, but the solution can never really just be individuals keeping themselves safe from this bias. It needs to be a system-wide solution, kind of making sure that kind of unfairness and discrimination can never happen, regardless of whether the individual is able to tell how these prices are being set, especially because kind of algorithms are often so complicated. There can be so many different factors determining what these outcomes are, that it's difficult for regulators and for experts, let alone for individual consumers, to be able to protect themselves.
Definitely.
Great, but to jump into this report, this was put together at the end of last year and released just last week. I think the first thing to emphasize is that this report wasn't just an investigation into Tinder, into dating apps. It was a broader look at this deeper issue of personalized pricing in the online economy. Personalized pricing, for those unfamiliar, is setting a specific price for each individual consumer. So not just a fixed discount for students or the elderly, but really individualized prices based usually on an estimation of how much each consumer is willing and able to pay. The approaches for this are pretty variable, but they almost always draw on an algorithm to set these prices, which really opens the door to bias and the potential for discrimination, even unintentionally most often. Our choice of Tinder as a case study for this report came about for a few reasons, for those wondering why there's this focus on dating apps. First off, in purely practical terms, its premium service, Tinder Plus, is very widely used, recognizable, and a straightforward product offered consistently across a few global markets, so really allows for comparison there. We also know that Tinder, like other dating apps, and hence this focus, has access to a lot of really personal data. To even sign up to Tinder, you have to give them your name, your age, your gender, your sexual preferences, access to your location data. And on top of this, we know that Tinder and other dating apps gather really large amounts of data on all of their users, kind of data subject access requests in the past, where people have asked for information that the company is holding on their data, have showed that there's this huge amount available. And if you sign up through social media or your email, there's more information that potentially could be used in pricing. We also chose Tinder because we wanted to build on the existing work of consumer organizations in this space. Consumers International member in Australia, Choice, carried out a similar investigation in 2020, which highlighted the wide range of prices offered and the potential for unfairness, but received no response from Tinder. We also noted there was a court case in California a couple of years back on age discrimination in Tinder Plus pricing, Tinder Plus being the premium service of Tinder, whereby you pay a bit of money every month to have kind of access to premium features. And Tinder agreed to settle this court case for $24 million. But there are still signs later in this investigation in Australia that personalized pricing and age-based pricing in particular were continuing. So can we jump to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So before we get to this investigation into Tinder, I just wanted to highlight another part of this study that hasn't got so much attention, understandably, but we think is really important to this work of building solutions, was a survey of consumer perceptions of personalized pricing, how we understand fairness in this online marketplace in algorithmic pricing. So we asked over 500 mystery shoppers across more than 6 countries, their perceptions on concerns about personalized pricing, their thoughts on perceived benefits, and what actions might improve these perceptions. And we expected there to be concerns, but I think the level of almost universal level of concern was particularly notable. 97% expressed some level of concern, only 3% saying they had no concerns at all about algorithms being used to personalize prices. In particular, issues highlighted were this potential for unfairness, especially against certain groups or against different income levels, as well as concerns about the use of personal data, how that shapes this pricing process, but also how it's shared elsewhere, and these broader risks. We also used this survey to explore what solutions might look like. I know we're getting into this later, so I won't go into too much detail here, but again, it was really notable. There was really strong support in all 6 countries for measures to increase transparency, both on how prices are set and how data is being used, but also for regulatory action to, as I say, make sure this doesn't happen in the first place, that there's no possibility for unfairness in this algorithmic pricing. Can we get the next slide, please? So onto the Tinder case study, the headline grabbing outcome was from the report was this finding on age, previous slide, I jumped ahead there. Was this finding on age? Users aged over 30 across the 6 countries were charged 65% more than those aged 18 to 29, which is a pretty huge disparity. In many cases, it was even more. In some of the countries we looked at, this was older users were charged more than double this younger price bracket. Now, arguably, this finding is, although caused by an algorithm, is not algorithmic bias, but was a deliberate outcome. Tinder have told us before that they use age in shaping pricing. They don't tell consumers at the point of purchase. There's no information that this is happening beyond deep down in the terms of use. There's information that you might be offered discounts based on personal data, but most consumers will never see this, and there's no reason to believe that anyone would understand that this means that this data can be used to set prices. Anyway, the point is that age is deliberately factored into prices, although not for much longer. Tinder have told us that they are beginning to phase out this practice in several countries, including the US, and the same will happen in other countries too. We've not had much detail on this front yet, but it seems like a promising start, that there's kind of this attention is eliminating unfair practices. However, another key finding from our research that I'd like to highlight that's slightly harder to communicate in a headline, but is arguably even more significant, is this point on unknown factors driving pricing. We know that age wasn't the only factor. Unfortunately, as I said, it's so complicated, we weren't able to precisely determine what these other factors were. Even if you could get inside this black box of the algorithm, it takes a lot of expertise, a lot of time to work out what is setting prices. We did look at the impact of gender, sexuality, location, other factors that are other information that's given to Tinder upon registration. We didn't find any statistically significant evidence of this impact, so there's no clear evidence that they're relevant, and Tinder have told us that they don't factor gender or sexuality into pricing. However, we did still find lots of variation at local level in different countries, signs of differences of certain groups paying more or less that probably aren't intentional, but there is this risk that even unintentionally, once an algorithm is making a decision, if a bias is built in, this is replicated in every single decision it makes over and over, and if certain groups pay more as a result, that is still unfair, regardless of whether it's deliberate. A final point to mention is that these unnamed factors aren't necessarily personal data. Prices can vary for all sorts of reasons. Tinder mentioned to us that variations are based on currency exchange rates, on whether you're using an Apple phone or an Android phone. There are probably more. But the point remains that consumers are being charged different prices to one another without any transparency on that this is happening or how these prices are set. Next slide, please. Great. So just to follow up on that point about age not being the only factor shaping prices, I'm going to share one table from the report. I promise it's the only one, because I know there's a lot of numbers out of context there, but I think it's just important to emphasize the level of variation we're talking about here. It's not pennies, it's not even the 60%, 100% difference we saw in age. Users are paying up to between 4 and 6 times more, the highest paying users in each country compared to the lowest. We see in the US here, the lowest price was $4.99 for a month of Tinder Plus membership. The highest price was $26.99, more than 5 times higher. We've got similar findings in 5 of the 6 countries surveyed. The only exception was Brazil, where there are only 2 different prices offered. If we look over to the last column too, I think this is a really important takeaway, is that this point on unique prices quoted. We saw that prices being that we surveyed 96 users of Tinder in each of these 6 countries, and clearly a huge number of different prices were quoted, as many as 31 different unique individual prices to users in the Netherlands. Some of this can maybe be explained, as Tinder say, by kind of currency variation or small scale impacts, but I think there's a really important piece of evidence from the US here, where these weren't kind of differences of pennies. This was, every price was X dollars 99 cents, a clear pricing tier. And there are still 9 different prices. This clearly isn't, as Tinder say, one price for under 30s and one price for over 30s. We don't know exactly what is causing this, but it's clear that age is not the only factor in this. Next slide, please. Great, so just to wrap up, I think, again, we're going to go in a bit more detail later, but another part of the research I don't want to overlook is this focus on recommendations, what we can do to solve this problem. So we're focused on transparency, both for consumers at the point of purchase, but also to be able to look at this price setting process, at algorithms, and make sure that they're not unfair, that there is no bias built in, even unintentionally. So if there's one takeaway from this research, it should be that it's not just a problem with Tinder or with dating apps. We want transparency from Tinder and from all companies, of course, but the deeper problem is this digital economy and the lack of regulation that allows this to happen in the first place. So our first priority has to be plugging that gap and making sure, this is happening in dating apps now, there's a risk that it can spread to essential services, that all kinds of things you buy online could be subject to this personalized pricing, and therefore opens the door to algorithmic bias. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was a really thorough dive in and also just so fascinating. Just a reminder to those joining us today, please do let us know your questions. I have a couple follow-up questions, Charlie. I don't know, Jen, if you do as well, but we have a couple audience questions that might be cool to do. I would love to there's a question here on how many people were surveyed in Brazil. On that chart, I think the last one had 2. And so like, how do you know the price differences are even accurate if you don't have enough people in that survey, specifically for Brazil or for somewhere else?
For sure. No, that column was just the number of different prices quoted, but was quoted to many people. So in Brazil, we still had 96 participants in the research, but all of them were quoted 1 of 2 different prices. But interestingly, even this wasn't just based on age. There wasn't one price for older users and one for younger. We couldn't tell at all. There was no indication of what was determining these 2 different prices. So even then, there still is uncertainty in what is driving prices and still potential for bias.
Yeah, of course. So for those of you looking where the last column numbers were alarming to you, that was not an indication of how many people participated. That was just like how many various pricings were found for all the people in a certain area. So as I saw, there was like large amount of pricing differences in somewhere like the US, which is where I live. And I would be like, why are we charging so many different prices? Because if I go on a dating app or any app, it usually just gives me the one price. or it says you want pro or extra pro. And so all those things, like you usually get 2 options max. And so for all of the different variations you showed in that chart, it means there's a lot of other things happening in the background that are charging people different prices. There's a question in the chat as well of, did you have information on pricing specifically for adults over 40? Like, did that come out, and was that different? And how did that change any of the pricing metrics?
Yeah, for sure. We did also look at, we had these age groups of 18 to 29, 30 to 49, and 50 and over. And we found that there was no statistically significant difference between 30 to 49 and 50 plus. There was slight variation at certain levels. I think generally users aged over 50 paid very slightly less, but Tinder tell us that they haven't done this, that this isn't part of their pricing. So again, if there is bias on that basis, it's again likely unintentional, but just because we weren't able to prove it here doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just takes a kind of a huge amount of kind of resources. This was already a study of over 500 people to be able to confirm what was happening without that insight into the algorithm. It would need to be kind of many times bigger.
Great, thank you so much, Charlie. My specific question, which I really want to call out specifically for those joining us today, is like, we always talk about personalized pricing and price transparency and these sort of like algorithmic biases and how many people are getting. Can we just take a moment to think about, like, what are the risks and benefits to getting different pricing? Like, is there times in which those are like good for us as consumers, or are there times in which we can get the benefits without like the risks of getting higher ones? Like, what are those moments that we can think of? Charlie, I don't know if you have an answer. You want to jump in? Jen, if you can think of times when there are benefits for us getting personalized pricing.
Yeah, I'm happy to get started. Again, this is something we look at in the report because kind of all the work being done on personalized pricing, it's very rare to see someone call for it to be banned entirely. I think there is generally recognition that it can be of value. That's, for instance, making products more affordable for those who can't afford it. The goal in theory is to set prices according to what people are willing and able to pay. And obviously the willing to pay causes a concern in terms of consumer fairness. But if there is a good way of being able to tell how much people are able to pay and making that fair on that basis, for instance, consumers are generally supportive of discounts for students or for pensioners, that there is a way of doing this. The challenge is, how do you do that without kind of huge data privacy implications, without getting this hugely detailed information? The risk, obviously, of getting it wrong as well, this lack of transparency creates a risk of unfairness, even in the cases where there is an algorithmic bias. Consumers knowing that these different prices are being charged, they can't be safe from that risk of unfairness, really erodes trust in the online marketplace and makes it harder for consumers to feel safe online. Also a risk of kind of undermining competition. If companies aren't transparent about this, then kind of major players like Tinder dominate this in this market, and in other markets, comparable businesses can use personalized pricing to charge more, to beat out the competition, and to, as a result in higher prices for consumers.
Thanks so much, Charlie. I definitely know and appreciate the like student discounts or senior discounts we see, and I think we all often agree like that's a great benefit, especially to getting particular audiences on, especially if you're part of a community or a network. And so it can get confusing because different pricing can sometimes be really beneficial. But then we see this issue where without the transparency, where we're finding that pricing is just different across the board for different groups. And without knowing which those groups are, we can't really feel like whether it's fair or not. But yeah, it's definitely worth digging into. Jen, did you have any, like, we're so thankful to Consumers International and Mozilla to create a report. I know Charlie spent so much time with it. Did you have any questions for Charlie, or just breaking this down?
Well, I have a question that's just more of a, hopefully Charlie can answer it. It's something that I think about because I think about consumers every day, and I'm a consumer. And, you think about, well, what can I as a consumer do about this? And if you go back pre-internet, haggling was a thing. And and standing up for yourself is a thing. And I know that consumers can, opt not to use a company that maybe has a bad track record, but that's not always the best option. And so I'm just curious, like, are there real things consumers can do to kind of drop their prices, or get the best price? Or, is haggling an option? I mean, it would almost be funny to haggle with an algorithm. So I'm just throwing out maybe a random hypothetical, but I'd love to noodle on that for a little bit and hear what you and Charlie have to say.
Yeah, it's a big question. I guess that's an interesting effect of this move towards the digital economy, is that not only does it increase the power of companies to set prices, to use algorithms and other technology, but it also undermines the power of the consumer to really fight their corner. It's much harder to ensure that your rights are upheld, whether that's through getting a fair price or through right to redress or all kinds of consumer rights, if you're doing it through a screen over kind of hundreds, thousands of miles. So there's clear that the direction of travel is away from that consumer agency and consumer rights. And I think in terms of that big question of how do you make a system of pricing that is fair, has to start with these kind of guardrails to make sure that discrimination is kind of proactively and unfairness proactively tackled, so that consumers feel safe to engage and are able to reclaim some of this power that might have been lost by that digitalization.
Yeah, just the thought of haggling with an algorithm gets me so excited, and I love that idea. It's so hard to realize an actualization though, because we don't often have control or know when the algorithm is impacting things. So I think that's part of the like power we need to give back to people, to realize like how can they get in there or connect with the algorithm or have an impact? How can we talk back to the algorithm? And so I think that's part of the part that I said earlier of like, it's really hard for us to see the differences in algorithms and discrimination or inequity that exists when these things happen. And so much of what I know was on Charlie's slides, or like I know even Mozilla or Consumer Reports has called for, is like, just let's have transparency. So once we have transparency and know our options or know what the algorithm is using or charging or doing in the background, we can have haggling power. I would love haggling power. My mother would love haggling power. But like, we can then get to the question of like, okay, then what are our options as people? And so I do love that kind of prod in, because I feel like it kind of is like, well, this is what all three of our orgs are doing, is just like pushing for that sort of power back to people. But speaking of like transparency, I know we've said it a bit, I've seen it in the chat, and I just really want to own in on that, because it is one of the solutions and answers that is so often talked about when it comes to algorithms and addressing some of these biases, and how transparency can actually affect the service or the impact. And I just would love to break that down with both of you, because I think you have two totally different perspectives, and we're talking well beyond dating apps right now. I'm talking about algorithms that fuel all the things we use, whether it's in person or digitally. What is the importance of having that transparency? Like, how will it actually get to the change and impact these products and services we use?
I'm happy to jump in and kick this off. I can say from my experience with Privacy Not Included, I've reviewed over 200 products. And one of the things we look at when we review those products is what sort of transparency do they have? If the product uses AI or an algorithms, what sort of transparency do they have in that? And I'd wager that a good at least 90% of the products that we've looked at don't have any sort of transparency into how these products are making decisions for you and using your data to make decisions for you. And for me, that comes down to, I want to make decisions about me. I want to have the opportunity to make my own poor choices. I want to have the opportunity to step outside and try something different, and not just kind of get pigeonholed into, oh, this product knows that this is who you are and you can't be anyone else. And I'm a little older, and I'm getting set in my ways. So sometimes I want to change it up and try something different. But if you're a younger person still trying to sort out your life and figure things out, it feels like it could be really harmful to have these algorithms kind of push you into a world that you can't experience other things because the algorithms have made these decisions and you don't even know how these decisions are being made. So I think for humans to be humans, we have to have the option to try something new or think something different. And sometimes algorithms don't allow us that. And I think that's one of the things that I worry about when it comes to the lack of transparency in this is, they could be making us into things that we don't want to be made into. And that's scary.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I think just building on that, something that we looked at is a lot of the resistance from companies or others using algorithms to practice pricing is that they don't always know exactly how these work, that there's no kind of proactive measures to make sure there's no algorithmic bias, that there's not a lot of knowledge even by those who are applying it on what actually what's going into it, let alone what's coming out of it, what the ramifications of these decision making is. Something that we've really emphasized in our work on this is meaningful transparency. So not just kind of putting the information out there, but making it easily accessible for consumers. There's this point about, there's some research that we quoted that showed that disclosures on using algorithms to set pricing, that phrased it misleadingly, that talks about, again, offering discounts, actually made consumers more vulnerable to algorithmic bias because people think, okay, discounts sounds great, but that's not how this works. Someone getting charged less means someone is being charged more, and there is this algorithmic process. So meaningful transparency to actually understand how these prices are being set and not just the fact that it's happening is important for consumers, and even more important for those with the capacity to audit and regulate and make sure that these practices aren't discriminatory.
Yeah, it's so important. And that's why so many of us are pushing for more transparency across these so that we can both have the choice, but also understand the decision making behind it. There's a great question we have going on that says a lot of people do not read terms and agreements for privacy and other things when signing up for a service such as Tinder or others. Could consumers perhaps be overlooking policies specifically regarding this very issue? Like consumers waiving the right to haggling? Like, is that in the privacy policies that we're just like totally skipping over and not reading because they're too small and too detailed for us? And we know just most people are just clicking accept so that they can get access to the products. Like, are we giving away our rights in that section?
Well, as a person who's read a lot of privacy policies, now, to be fair, how much a product costs isn't going to be talked about in a privacy policy. That's going to include, what data they collect and how that data is handled. The terms of service would probably reflect a little bit more about the payment and things like that. And so, and yeah, as somebody who reads privacy policies for a living, like they're terrible and they're confusing and I hate reading them, and it's my job. And so it's understandable why people don't read them. And are you giving up rights to haggling? I mean, I've never seen haggling mentioned in any terms of service. I really think that we need to start a campaign now with the our three organizations and everybody to just go out and haggle with everybody to see with Amazon and Tinder and Netflix, and see if we can all get better prices with haggling with them, because that would be a really fun a thing. And so to answer the question, are we giving up our rights? I mean, the companies write these policies to give them, I mean, if you've ever read them, they're very vaguely worded. A lot of mays, or hey, we do this, and that means that we use this for legitimate business purposes, and that's a very vaguely worded statement. And then they say things like, and that can include things like things that sound very nice. They only put the things that sound very nice in. They don't put the things that sound terrible. And so it's really tricky. And so I would say, based on my experience reviewing a lot of companies, but specifically with dating app companies, just don't trust them. Don't trust these companies. They have terrible track records. A lot of them have terrible track records when it comes to protecting data, being honest about things. So just be careful. I don't know if that actually answers the question, but that's my takeaway is just be careful and don't trust.
Yeah, agreed. I think to building proper consumer protection, you have to start from the position that nobody is going to read the terms and conditions because not many people do. Protection only for those with the time and the means to understand and process and work out what this all means is not protection at all. And especially if the risk is of bias is risk against the most vulnerable, they're probably also the least likely to have the time or whatever to go through these kind of detailed terms and conditions. And it's good that they're there, but again, it's good that they're there more for us, for people who are looking at it as their jobs to make sure everything is above board and not for consumers really, that this has to be the digital economy in general will only work if people can trust in practice that they don't need to go through the hundreds of pages every time they read some of these terms and conditions.
Yeah, I definitely second and third those. I do feel like these the privacy controls are literally taking liability off an organization for many things that can come up or happen. And so many of them are like very sneakily worded in that case to make sure if like you experience different things or stuff happens that we are not liable for any of that. And so I do think there's like a precedent because there is no standard and there's no accountability to not do that. There's no laws and policies that we properly have in place that say they can't do that. And there's also a lot of like sneaky behavior that we see in the background. I think a lot about cookies and how, in the UK, for you, Charlie, you have GDPR, which is a global, like a policy across Europe and others that really governs, cookie management. Whereas, for Jen and I in the States, we don't have cookie management. And a lot of times we're forced to accept cookies on a site. We can't opt out. And cookies, they store and cache your data when you're on sites, and they worry me so much because they share so much of your demographic info when you are going across platforms or sites or others. And I think they are really like the soul of our data online. And once a company gets access to your cookies and can store stuff on you, they have access to like all your information. And so, it doesn't even matter if they're accepting the privacy policies or not, or if you can or can't, but at the same time, like you're still getting low levels of options or you're not seeing your options because we don't have policies in place to protect consumers in that sort of lens. So all of this is just so important. We have tons of questions, but I do want to leave space because, we talked a little bit about the algorithmic issues, but we talked about general privacy issues specific to dating apps and other apps in general. And Jen, I know you've been working on a report, or did a report with Privacy Not Included on other privacy issues. And I'm wondering if we can just pause to talk a little bit more about that, and then we're going to come back to the rest of these questions.
Sure, yeah, I can talk a little bit about what I learned last year when we did dating app research and what I've seen as a consumer privacy advocate. And then I really want to get to the question. So last year we reviewed the privacy and security of 24 dating apps, and 21 of the 24 dating apps earned our Privacy Not Included warning label that we put on when, the actions and the privacy policies of these companies trip a certain level of concern for us, which kind of tells me that as a group, as a whole, dating apps are really bad at privacy. And the reasons that I found for that are, one, they collect a huge amount of very personal information, your pictures, your location, but also your preferences, the things you like, the things you dislike. Some of them ask for height, some of them ask for your religion, some of them ask for your parents' names. It's really wild the amount of information these collect. Almost all of the dating apps that we reviewed had at some point had some sort of data breach or data leak. And so you can read the privacy policy and be like, okay, they aren't selling my data. That's a win. They are sharing my data, and I'm, with all these third parties, that it's really confusing what that means. But that means that they're sharing potentially personal information. A lot of times they'll say they make it anonymous, but we all know that anonymous is really hard to make, especially when location is tied to anything. There was an instance last year where a Catholic priest was outed due to Grindr location data and lost his job. And this was gathered through data brokers. And so it's really concerning the amount of information they collect. And then, data data, sharing the data to make more money through advertising, pretty common practice. But the lack of security, like I said, nearly all of them had data leaks or data breaches. And so, they can say everything in their privacy policy you want to hear, but if a hacker gets in, or an employee is, spies on you, or, they just have a bug in their stuff that makes things vulnerable, then it's out there. And so you just should be very careful. And I want to read one of my favorite lines I ever saw in a privacy policy. It's from the Hinge privacy policy. Hinge is a dating app. And it says, the line says, "We do not promise, and you should not expect, that your personal information will always remain secure." And, kudos to Hinge for just coming right out and saying it in their privacy policy, like, hey, we're going to do our best, but you shouldn't expect that anything you give us will remain secure. And I would tell people that that's how you should approach dating apps specifically, but almost all of the consumer products that collect a fair amount of information on the internet, because and I like these. I have a fitness tracker. I have a smart speaker. I stream TV. I like all this stuff. And so I just approach it by being wary and recognizing that anything I put out there, somebody could see. And so everybody should do that. And that's kind of, I want to wrap up now because I know we have a bunch of questions, but my takeaway, if there's one takeaway, is don't trust these companies, especially the dating app companies, and just be careful what you put out there.
Yeah, and Jen, no need to rush, because this is all fascinating. And I think as we think about privacy and security, this is all part of the picture. This is all like the security we have when we use these places, the trust that we place in them to know that we're not being treated differently, or that they won't have different outcomes. And so it is part of that one picture that I know we all across the three organizations are constantly focused on, like, how do we uncover the different things in these issues that are affecting people across a myriad of things. So thanks, Jen. And if there are more concerns about the privacy stuff, please ask the questions. But I'm going to start rolling through more of these questions in the Q&A. But there is a common thread in some of these that I really want to pull out, because going beyond just dating apps, like, people have been asking really specific, like, how deep does this go? Does it go as deep, the algorithmic biases? Is it going as deep as, like, buying books, like buying tickets to somewhere, or like travel itineraries? Like, where is it affecting us more? And like, how do we know when it's happening to us? And I think that's such an interesting but great question to ask. Like, how do we find out if we are charged a different price in these places that we're going online, whether it is a dating app, or booking a flight for a ticket somewhere else, or just like using any service or tool as we would? I have some thoughts, but Jen, Charlie, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's really hard. It's the whole point of this focus, the focus of this research. I think generally a good clue is if you try and look up what the standard price is and you can't find one, that means something is up. Something we did look at in the report was obviously research into algorithmic bias, as we found, is even harder, because the kind of burden of proof, you need really strong evidence that it's so hard to attain without access to how these algorithms are working, to prove that there is this consistent bias. There is a bit of research, not enough, into the prevalence of personalized pricing that's found, again, mostly focused on North America, Europe, but that's found that it certainly is fairly widespread in kind of hotels, airline booking industries, ones where we're slightly more expectant by now that this is happening. We know that prices are a little bit dynamic. It's not, as far as we can tell, as far as others can tell, not super widespread in other industries yet, largely not because there isn't the capacity, but because there's so much resistance to it from consumers. I think any product where you would easily know, like buying books, where you might compare a price or see it in different forums, anywhere where consumers can tell they're being charged a different price, having that personalized pricing and that potential for bias really turns people off of products. They go elsewhere. It's only those products where the companies can viably conceal from you what your price is compared to what other people are getting that is there. So not our preliminary findings. Obviously, I don't want to promise anything because it's so hard to tell, but it's not as widespread as it could be. It generally hasn't reached the kind of essential services too much. Although we are interested in looking at insurance. Obviously, we know draws in some ways explicitly on data. So it'd be interesting to know how that ties in. But the barrier, as I say, is public opinion, not technological capacity. So the risk is there as things change. That's why it's so important to get ahead of it and make sure protections are built in.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, there is no transparency algorithm, so there's not a lot of that people can do to like get transparency right now. And I liken it a little bit, as you were talking, Charlie, to buying a car before the internet days. You kind of, one person would walk on a car lot and get charged a way different price than another person walked on a car lot. And then along came Consumer Reports, and you could at least like get their car manual every year and at least kind of see some standard pricing. And then the internet came along and we were able to compare, and you could kind of see, oh, this is what this car this is what this car should cost, and the dealer's trying to charge me $5,000 extra. And I think right now we're kind of in a similar place where it's just really hard to find out. You can always do a little of your own research, which is putting way too much on the consumer. Again, this is what companies do. But if you and all your buddies are on Tinder, ask around and see how much they're paying, can compare it to you. And and if you're paying something different, you don't have a lot of recourse. That's the unfortunate thing. But you can, I guess, leave Tinder and go to, I don't know, somewhere else, Bumble. Yeah, it's really hard right now, and it's just not a consumer friendly environment, and that's why we do what we do.
Yeah, and I think there's so much importance from each one of the orgs that we're representing is because we all do research in uncovering more of these issues as they live across the tools and products we use. And so we need more of this research so we can uncover it. And we need more education in schools and with teams to be able to like tackle some of these issues in other sorts of ways. And so that is there, but there are industries we just keep uncovering that we know have more of this. And so like dating apps is now one that we're very aware of thanks to this report. But also like a long time standing, to that question, airline industries or buying flights can largely take from your data and charge you different prices. That has been something that we have known and have research on, depending on the data that you're sharing. So maybe it's your location or how many times you visited or checked those flight times or dates or others that we know is all about navigating that and what are the algorithm knows about you and how that's feeding it, and then what does it output to you. So I think these things are all super critical, and in some industries it is way more known now than others, but we still have to keep doing the research and like getting whether it's academics or advocates to peek behind the lens to understand like where is this data coming from, how is it used, and what is the result coming out of here so we can better advocate for those changes. In the question someone asked about companies like Alibaba or Amazon might engaging in bias. And I think it's fair to say that we don't have the answers to all these things. Assumably, yes, but also we don't always have the research in place that we can point to really understand that. So we need more data around like what Charlie and others did around figuring out what are the price differences being used against us online so we can advocate for it. Okay, so there are a couple questions that are like, this just feels gloomy and like, is there any way out of this? And so I really want to end with the last question before we wrap up on the, what are we as our organizations doing to take action against algorithmic biases? Whether it be dating apps or anywhere else, are we taking action against companies, against governments? And Alan is dropping some of the links already in the chat, so you can check them out. But Jen, do you want to speak for Mozilla? I'd love to hear more about what Mozilla is doing.
Yeah. I mean, there's a petition in there and you can sign that. That's a really low bar thing that you can do, because that's something that we will then take back and show to Tinder. It's like, look, people are angry about what you're doing. Can you do better? There's no guarantee that will change. It's a numbers game, right? And so Mozilla is, we do this every day. We're a nonprofit, like Consumer Reports and Consumer International, and we rely on the help from people to do this work. And it's some days I wake up and it's it's Mozilla versus Amazon, it's Mozilla versus Facebook, and it feels very daunting, but it's also very important. And I know, Mozilla has really invested in trying to work to build trustworthy AI. And AI, we know, is the wave of the future, right? Like, it's not going anywhere. It's going to be part of our lives for as far as we can see. And how do we build AI as we're kind of growing in this, and to be trustworthy and ethical and remove biases? And so that's one of the big things that we do. And then we also have projects like Privacy Not Included, where we do look into, all these consumer products that you and I and we all use, like, which ones are better and which ones are worse. And so, I can go, people always ask me, what should I buy? What should I not buy? And I can tell you, like, a company like Facebook has a really bad track record. And then there are some, Apple has a better track record, not perfect. Somebody was asking, what are some good dating apps? There's not many. You can go to Privacy Not Included and look. There were 3 that didn't get dinged with our warning label. Lex was one that I found to be probably the best. And unfortunately, it's only targeted to a small niche audience. But there are ones out there. So you, as a consumer, the best thing you can do is do a little research before you give your money to anybody, and then support the good people and keep your money away from the bad people.
Thanks, Jen. Charlie, what's Consumer International doing?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, seconds, sign the petitions, go to Consumer Reports, find out where the better places to be are, the companies that are doing best on this. Obviously, as never are ones that are necessarily doing as much as we want, but there are better options. Our focus, and I know this is happening across the world, our members in the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, India are doing the same thing at that level, getting their government to take action against this, make sure that international.
Oh, it might have frozen for me. Charlie, are you there? Okay, yeah, it froze for some of us. We will post links on Consumers International stuff that Charlie's talking about as well. Hopefully we can get him back. I will say, on the Consumer Report sides, we are really dedicated to researching and finding out more information and reporting about these algorithmic biases so we can better understand them. And we have a petition out right now as well around the Algorithmic Accountability Act that is just being introduced, and asking for more transparency in it so that people will know what's happening when these things happen. Charlie, it looks like you're back for me, so I just want to point back to you and see if it works. Oh, I have you muted now. I don't know why I can't hear you.
Is that any better?
Yeah, there you are. Okay, great.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, no, I was just saying, we're still working with national governments, with regulators at national, international level, to build a marketplace in which consumers don't.
It looks like we lost Charlie again. Okay. We are going to send out all the resources and links. So if you haven't captured things, don't worry. We will send that out on what Mozilla is doing, Consumer International, and Consumer Reports, and all the ways for you to participate and learn more about how we're engaging in these different issues. Since we are at time, I want to say a deep thank you to Jen and Charlie for joining me today and talking about this. Thank you to Mozilla and Consumers International for creating that report and doing the work that we need to understand this more. So important. You can find copies of our past workshops online. And if you have ideas for new ones, just let us know. I see some in the chat, so thank you so much. And if you have any questions or concerns, please do get in touch with us at community@cr.consumer.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And be sure to tune into the recording and links, which we'll share after the call. Thank you.